Hello, beautiful community. Let's debrief a bit about Putin's bizarre 9th of May parade by looking at the strange place of the myth of the Second World War in that regime's ideology and in Russian culture. And that's important not just because of the know thy enemy principle. It's also important because looking at pathologies in an intense form in certain cultures allows us to relate more freely to the more minor equivalents of the same pathology we have at home. It feels super weird to us what we're seeing in Russia on 9th of May because it feels to us that it's obviously their number one cultural myth, and it is their number one cultural myth. I mean, if you measure cultural myths in the size of buildings, it's the tallest building they've got by far. And it's also perverse to us because there is such an extravagant post-truth relationship to that bit of that country's history. And it's a ubiquitous relationship, a ubiquitous historical pathology. You can have historical pathologies toward some bits of your history, but you can also have cultures that run into the trouble of being pathological about all of their history. They are simply pathological about where they've come from and where they're going. Now, that doesn't mean that all Russians are, but it's a significant cultural deformation that to some extent affects most people in that culture. Now, don't go around thinking that you don't have cultural sicknesses where you are too. You do. Now, the perversion here is at least twofold. On the one hand, we look at this centering of that myth and we look at how much of a post-truth centering it is, right? They just take a box that's Stalin or the Second World War, and they, in this instance, I mean the regime, just shove into it whatever they want. So it's a sort of cipher that has no relationship to that bit of concrete history or to any other bit of concrete history. And that's strange to us. But there's something else that's really strange to us, and that is that people like Tim Snyder go around and call that regime fascist. And it's certainly not obvious that Tim's wrong. Simply because if you look at the cultural wash of ingredients related to each other by family resemblances that constitute fascism, a certain reactionary demand for a past hierarchical order, typically that never really was, a revolutionary demand, somewhat in conflict with this first demand, to overthrow all orders that have existed, the aestheticization of violence and militancy, the increasing centrality of the state, the conceptualization of all opponents as enemies, the conceptualization of all relations in politics as relations between friend and foe, whereby at the limit it's a matter of who will outdo who physically. Certainly several ingredients are missing. I think the cult of the personality is missing to some extent. And of course, this business of all-encompassing politicization is missing. It hasn't happened. To some extent, we could say it hasn't happened yet. But even if these two bits appeared the cult of the personality and the politicization of the population, that regime's ideology would still have many features that can't be captured just by a broad description of fascism as an ideology. So it'd probably be more than fascism, even if it were fascism. But the degree to which it carries fascist elements makes the possibility that it's a version of fascism a reasonable candidate for conversation, right? So it's at the minimum a plausible claim that Tim's making. He needs to make it good, but it's a plausible claim that he's making. So what have we got as the result? We've got a partly fascist celebration of a victory over fascism. That's that second bit that's really bizarre to us. The degree to which it's just an empty post-truth cipher is bizarre to us, and the degree to which it stinks of fascism and is a fascism stinking celebration of victory over fascism. Interestingly, because I left the Soviet Union when I was 9, back then, if you asked people how central is this idea of the victory in the Second World War to your cultural identity, to your sense of national pride, many fewer people would have put it number one relative to now. So even though in 1989 we were almost as close to the Second World War as 1989 is close to us today, still back then in Russia, Soviet Russia, the degree to which people would have centered that myth would have been less, even though so many people who went through it would have been alive still. Now, when you're talking about a situation in which you've got this introduction of a cipher, it's kind of silly to talk about actual historical elements that are missing, actual historical elements that are missing from this ideological myth of the Second World War. But nevertheless, it's worth mentioning, and I jotted down a few. Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And interestingly, Molotov's grandson has been around parading a picture of his grandfather as part of all of these celebrations, which emphasizes the non-triviality of this bizarre quasi-fascist celebration of victory over fascism point we've just made. What's missing is that the war was won despite and not because of Stalin. And then missing are the Soviet army crimes. Missing is this acknowledgement of the legitimating role of the victory in the Second World War for Soviet totalitarianism. What's missing is that the Soviet army liberated and occupied and occupied and liberated. And I'm sort of with, at least in some contexts, lovely British historian Richard Evans, who, for instance, about the Baltics would frame for us that the Baltics weren't liberated, but they were rescued. That's to say, a less evil occupation rescued folks from a more evil occupation. Of course, what's missing is the Russian human experience of war. We'll say later about the experience of other peoples. It's also missing. But Russian experience of the war, the post-war years, the losses, inconceivable losses, and it's not just missing, it's been positively erased. I mean, there was an enterprise to erase, for instance, the siege of Leningrad from memory. Because Stalin liked victory, he didn't like the history of the war. And the loyal Leningrad authorities were temporarily during the siege sort of isolated from the regime, and Stalin didn't like any of it, and they were eliminated. And the memorial, the museum capturing that experience was destroyed later on in the 40s, and on a smaller scale recreated in the late 80s. So there was an attack on the actual incorporation into cultural discourse of the experience of the war. The war vets were sidelined and silenced, and so on. The list continues, but we've had enough. So, what the hell are they going to do? Because they have two options. They can either come out of that myth, and the Russians, and they can say, well, it's now not a top 10 historical myth for us, or they can go forward in it. That is to say, make it much less toxic and much less pathological. And I can't ethically participate in this, I think, because I'm not Russian enough to tell them what to do. But certainly looking at it from the sidelines, I don't see any other option except going forward in it. I do not see the option of retreating from the myth of the Second World War as a central myth in Russian culture. So if they are to come out of it, what are they going to do? And I think that there've got to be two pillars here, and that is something that some of the Russian opposition should be a bit more interested in. Part of the reason they're not, interestingly, is because they're scared of patriotism. So to some extent, the Russian opposition have found themselves almost tracking some of the magical thinking going on in the West or in Ukraine about the disappearance of Russia, funnily enough. And they've incorporated that, but in such a way that it's actually conducive to the perpetuation of Russian violence and destructiveness politically. So it's an awkward dilemma. That the Russian opposition do not focus enough on Russia's security needs and do not focus enough on healthy patriotism. And you don't need to be told that no national project gets off the ground without a good deal of patriotism, right? You want to defeat Trump, you've got to appeal to what America is all about, So if they were to come out of it, of that pathological form of the myth, there'd need to be at least two ingredients there. One is a severing of the people in the regime, the counterposing the people against the regime, and seeing it as a victory of people and different kinds of people, despite the regime. And the second pillar would be a pillar of decolonization, which not only recognizes the role of other peoples in that extraordinary conflict and in that victory, but also directs a decolonizing eye inside Russia, not just outside Russia. And the decolonizing eye inside Russia puts front and center the question of what holds Russian citizens together, and tries to give that question answers that actually make sense, that actually have friction, that actually address the consciousness of millions of people living in that territory about the extraordinary political situation they find themselves in. And you could absolutely leverage the myth of the Second World War in a more healthy decolonizing direction. This is something about which we'll talk about more, but I'll cut off for now because this conversation could go on for hours. It's my birthday tomorrow, and health allowing, I'm not sure if health will allow, but health allowing, I might do a little birthday live here on the chat channel where you can ask me anything. Take care till then. Lots of love.